Today I'm going to talk about settlement finality and atomicity across different legal ledgers. This talk applies to different legal ledgers even if they are on the same blockchain or DLT infrastructure, i.e. shared ledgers. This is a point that comes up frequently in discussion around cross-ledger transactions, whether they are blockchain or conventional ledgers. There's a lot of confusion on these two concepts and how they work. Let's start with finality. In financial services, finality is a point in time. It is that point of time when a transaction is legally irreversible. Ownership has passed to the new person. In particular, if a company goes bankrupt, that thing or asset which has passed finality is outside of the reach of the liquidator. So if I bought a car from a car dealer and the transaction was final, that car belongs to me, even if it remains on the lot for a day or two. If that dealer went bust in the meantime, that car cannot be claimed by a creditor or by the liquidator. Now let's talk about atomicity. An atomic transaction is one where more than one change of ownership takes place at the same time. Financial transactions can be huge in value and often involve one thing changing ownership one way and another thing changing ownership the other way. An FX transaction might be me sending you pounds and you sending me dollars in return. With such large amounts being moved, it's important that they both have finality at the same instant. That is, I legally own the dollars at the same time as you legally own the pounds. Now this is something different from a database atomicity. In most modern databases, you can group together a number of changes and they will all be committed to the database or none of them will. If one change fails halfway through the process, any which have already completed are unwound. To distinguish these, let's call the first financial atomicity and the second technical atomicity. Now let's ask two questions. When should the respective ledgers be updated? Before or after finality? And the second question is, if there is more than one ledger to update, what is the appropriate action if one fails? The first seems obvious. The ledger should only be updated once the transaction is final. That is to say, ledger updates happen after finality. And this is where we run into conceptual problems. The blockchain paradigm seems to offer a novel solution. Why not make finality and the ledger update the same thing? It's so tempting to say that you can achieve finality, financial atomicity, and technical atomicity all at one time. Unfortunately, this is a mirage. Let's look at a 3-node blockchain and assume that consensus has been achieved and a block needs to be committed, which contains all of the transactions that need to be atomic. Now let's assume that one of the nodes is down. 2 nodes commit the transaction, and sometime later, when the 3rd node is up again, it commits the transaction. So when is the transaction legally final? At consensus? When the first node commits the block? When the last node commits the block? If you choose the first option, consensus, you can ask again, when exactly does consensus happen? Typically, each node determines consensus independently. The fact is that in a distributed system, things don't happen on different nodes at the same time. Nodes evolve deterministically, but not at the same time. Settlement finality is a point in time, and it needs to be the same point in time for all participants. It needs to be a single identifiable event. This can be achieved by having a process that orchestrates or monitors consensus and declares finality when it becomes aware of all the necessary agreements. That brings us back to the first question. When should a ledger be updated? Before or after finality? One can think of this as a choice. If it is done before finality, it must be revocable. If it is done after finality, it is irrevocable. So if you consider the update to the ledger being the recording of an irrevocable change, it follows it can only be done after finality. That brings us to the second question. What happens if one participant does not update their ledger after finality is declared? What is the right thing to do for the other participants? The choices are to stay in their current state or to roll back. However, if the transaction is legally binding and irrevocable, but one participant has not recorded it, what would be the logic of the correct ledgers being rolled back? It makes much more sense for the errant ledger to catch up to the correct position. So the choice has to be that there is no rollback after finality, even if some of the ledgers have not been able to commit. This leads to an observation that atomicity in financial transactions across disparate ledgers is not implemented by technical atomicity, such as with an atomic transaction in a database. That is to say, there is no rollback if all ledgers cannot update. Atomicity is a property of having a shared legal finality declaration. I know this has been a bit detailed, however, it's important to understand a few things. First, finality is a point in time that must be identifiable precisely and must be the same for every ledger in the transaction. Second, distributed systems such as blockchains do not act in synchronization, so a leader, a notary, or an orchestrator is typically required to declare finality. Third, final irrevocable ledger updates can only happen after finality. And fourth, technical atomicity is not required or desirable after finality, as rollback serves no purpose. I appreciate you watching, and let me know what you think in the comments below.